So, welcome to our week on education policy. For today, we're going to be discussing education policy in the US, specifically as it compares to other countries, so the comparative context. Thus, we're going to be discussing test scores, outcomes by demographics, and also outcomes by administration, as well as just a general discussion of administration itself. So what we're seeing here are the 2018 PISA, or Program for International Student Assessment reading scores. PISA administers tests about every 3 years to students across the world to get a sense of how students in lots of different countries are doing and what ultimately are the most successful models. This is really intended to inform policymakers, right? It's not supposed to guilt educators specifically or anything like that, but it's to inform international education policy. Here you can see all the countries surveyed on the right, and forgive the teeny tiny writing, but it ranges from Singapore to the Philippines right here. And what you're seeing is reading scores and where the US stands. So the United States will be highlighted in this red box regarding, and then this is reading scores. So overall, we do really well compared to other countries when it comes to reading. The box on the left just zooms in a bit on where the United States stands and who our peers are. We tend to do about as well as students in Sweden, New Zealand, the UK, Japan, Australia. But how do we do when it comes to something like science? As can be seen on the right, we again rank fairly high. And looking to the zoomed in image on the left, we rank closely to the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, Australia, Sweden, Belgium, the Czech Republic. So overall, again, fairly well and very similar to reading scores. We do a bit worse though when it comes to math. We fall more in the middle of the pack here. Peers in this area are countries like Spain, Lithuania, Hungary, Bulgaria, or no, I think this is actually Belarus, Malta, and Croatia. So we do, again, fairly well when it comes to reading and science, but we lag a bit when it comes to math compared to other countries. Now, you might be wondering how we fared on these PISA scores since they started being measured in 2000. And these are just international education outcomes. In other words, how have our scores changed over time since 2000? And here, PISA tends to rely heavily on reading scores, even though they do the others as well. But here we're looking at reading, and we are included in the group that's remained mostly flat over time. So there are some groups who have increased their scores over time. They've become more positive. So from 2000 to 2018, and you can see it's places like Jordan, Russia, Estonia, Portugal, Germany, Colombia. But here the United States gets grouped in the flat category. We have not really seen significant changes. Here, we haven't seen improvements or declines in our scores since 2000. And this is true of many other countries, including Austria, Bulgaria, Canada, Denmark, France, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Norway, and us, right? Now, let's get down into how some of these scores break down by demographics. Specifically here, we're looking at immigration status. The diamonds over on the left indicate reading scores before adjusting for socioeconomic status. And the little rectangles here, the really thin rectangles, are when we've adjusted for socioeconomic status. And so here what we see is that in the US, without adjusting for socioeconomic status, students from immigrant backgrounds do slightly worse than native-born students. So if it falls into the gray area, it means that immigrant students scored a little bit lower than non-immigrant students, okay? But if it falls in this light blue area over here, that means immigrant students scored higher than non-immigrant students. But once you adjust for socioeconomic status, which just means that we're comparing immigrant and native-born students from the same socioeconomic group. Students with an immigrant background outperform native-born students. And really, this isn't unusual either. In Houston a few years ago, even without adjusting for socioeconomic status, students from immigrant backgrounds performed better than native-born students. Okay. Next up, we're going to look at reading scores by income. In the United States, it's quite common for income to be a predictor of test scores, but this isn't necessarily as true in other places. In our figure, right here, or you can look at the zoomed in one here, if income isn't driving differences in test scores, we would see sort of tight clustering around the diamond, sort of like we see here in Estonia and China. We would see tight clustering around the diamond, or a black diamond with only an arrow to the right. So here we see that income in Canada, Finland, Estonia, parts of China, that they are doing fairly well. In those places, income is not a huge determinant of reading scores. But in the US, what we can see here is that there are actually quite big differences in test scores between those who are from wealthy families and those who are from poorer families. Here, those in the US who are from the poorest 10% of families, so these people right over here, this between this black thin rectangle and this blue square, they score about between 430 and 450 on this reading test. Compare that to those in the US who are from the wealthiest 10% of families, so this blue circle to the arrow, where their reading scores are about 550 to 560. In other words, there's more than 100-point difference between the wealthiest and poorest families in the US, right? So yes, on average, the US does fairly well when it comes to reading scores, but be aware that there are some pretty big inequalities that those average scores hide, and those inequalities are partially driven here by income. We should also look at expenditures over time. So the United States spends some of the most over a student's cumulative education. So this is cumulative expenditures per student over the theoretical duration of their studies. That's along the x-axis. And the y-axis is their reading scores. We are this red right here. We clearly are spending a lot per student over the course of their education. But we're also doing fairly well in terms of reading, on average at least. You might also be wondering how much time we're spending per week in school compared to other countries. Here we can see that the US spends about a little more than the OECD on average on learning time every week. So here is the US and here is the OECD average of 44 hours. The x-axis is hours, and then the y-axis is reading scores. So we have a little less than 50 hours per week on instructional time or learning time, excuse me, and the average is about 44, meaning that we just have a little more than other countries. In the US, we also have a student-teacher ratio of about 15 students per teacher. You can find us right here. Which is a little above average compared to other countries. The US also fares fairly well on average. Again, this is on average when it comes to teacher pay. Our top of pay scale, so here you can see the United States top of pay scale is a little bit north of 70,000, which is pretty high compared to other countries. But obviously, I want to be clear here, there is variation in this across the country, with some states offering far more competitive salaries and packages than others. So I want to be clear about that. This doesn't reflect all states. This is just an average. So here, for today, we covered education policy in the US, specifically as it compares to other countries. Like we talked about test scores. We do well on reading and science, but not math. We talked about outcomes by demographics. We perform well overall, but our system has some significant disparities when it comes to children from poorer backgrounds. And we also talked about how administration in the US compares to other countries. So, on average, we have fairly high teacher salary. We also have somewhat high student teacher ratios, right? Or I should say, we have low student teacher ratios. But we sort of fall in the middle of the pack a little bit there too. But in any case, jump on over to the next video about federal education policy.